Hello everybody, the time has come to talk about war in Europa Universalis 5. Look at this glorious art they shared along with this Tinto talk. Very nice, very nice. Love to see it. So, today we're going to be talking only about Tinto Talk 11. This will be a bit shorter than our previous dives, I think. There's lots of interesting stuff here, and I've got, let me do a quick check, maybe 30 tabs open for Johan's replies. We'll dive into the stuff as usual. I won't be going through absolutely word by word here, but let's just talk about the stuff that I think is really interesting in here, and a little bit about how it's going to influence how we play. So, the key thing, the main thing that we've learned from this Tinto talk is that there are 3 different types of unit. There are levies, mercenaries, and regular regiments. Now, if you've played CK2, this is pretty familiar in that those are the same types that you have in CK2. Unlike in CK2, they are fully tied into the mechanics of the game, which is going to be brilliant. And there's a particular comment that we'll get to later, which I'll talk about it when we get there, but that really encapsulates what an excellent system this seems like it's going to be. There were, I had some negatives in the previous video. Honestly, on the military stuff that we've seen so far, no notes, really. Like, this seems extremely good. I'll probably come up with some concerns as we go, but I think so far this is looking extremely exciting. It allows us to model situations and decisions in such a plausible and engaging way, where you'll need to invest in things in a sensible way. You'll need to make cost-benefit analyses before you declare wars in a much more nuanced and interesting way. But let's dive into it. So this one is basically about, it's less about the good stuff, because we haven't talked too much about what buildings produce what goods and how that works. It's mostly about the kind of the manpower and the experience and stuff like that. So first off, we'll talk about how they're organized. There are large numbers of different units in categories: infantry, cavalry, artillery, auxiliaries. And this becomes clarified in the comments, to be clear. You don't have a type of infantry and a type of cavalry. You can have multiple types of cavalry, multiple types of infantry, etc. in the same nation at the same time. So you're actually building, a whole army. It's more similar to Victoria 2 or not Crusader Kings, what am I trying to say here? Or Imperator, than it is to EU4 in that sense, which is really interesting. The idea that we're going to be able to play with lots of different types of making armies. This is going to be my this is a defensive army, so I'm going to put auxiliary units in there that will help with being able to hold the line while reinforcements arrive, or something like that, or potentially more, putting a lot more siege cannon in something. It's going to be really interesting, I think. The size of regiments varies over time. Their combat width or frontage doesn't, it seems like. This is all not, super well understood at this stage, but what it seems like basically is, as time goes on, you can go from 100 men and infantry regiment to 3,200, but they have the same frontage value, I think. Some of this is I hope pending clarification, but what that will mean is that basically you can have more and more people fighting simultaneously as technology and military tactics and things advance, which makes sense and is really cool as a form of kind of escalating it. The idea that frontage in terrain is likely to stay the same then, I guess, across time, I think that will be easier to think about when you're worrying about designing your armies around a certain frontage. And then if that frontage stays consistent through the game, but what you're putting in the frontage changes, that's way easier to think about. Because I know, I like to think I was quite good at EU4 in my day. I've done my one faiths and so on. I've done my Ulm Emperor of both the HRE and China at the same time runs. It's been a good time. I've never been like a hardcore meta player. I can't tell you what the combat width is. Maybe any tech. Does it start at like 18 on Flatlands? Anyway, I can't tell you what the combat width is. Memorizing those kind of numbers and then building around it and knowing when to exactly to change, I don't really care about that kind of thing. I sometimes do, like if I'm really trying to achieve something, but that's not that's not really what I'm about. Whereas if there's slightly more consistent frontage decision making that you can make, and then iterating within that, that strikes me as much more interesting. So I'm excited about that change. And of course, just the armies scaling up and it all becoming more dramatic as centralized states are able to wield larger and larger forces. It's very cool. So yes, levy, mercenary, or regular regiment. So, sorry, I said for those of you who played CK3, CK2, you'll be familiar, but I should talk a bit more about what this actually means. So between your, and there's lots of numbers here, which are interesting. Units store food, auxiliaries carrying food and things may well be necessary. We're not going to dive into too much of these numbers because we don't know a lot about many of them, but it's looking like it's going to be interesting. The food consumption stuff, that's good. Yeah, managing your campaigns, you're going to have to think about a campaign, but we'll get more into that in a second. So levies are what they sound like. You levy them. You go into a village and you go, hey, you chum, you're no longer a farmer, you're now a fighter in your glorious king's army. Be grateful for it. Pick up a weapon. Get yourself in my army. We're going on campaign. And obviously there are drawbacks to doing that because their farm needed them. They were employed gainfully, hopefully, fighting. Well, yes, we talk about fighting, but they were fighting for the economy, baby, and now they're not. Plus, if they die, they die. As Johan said in one comment, which I don't think I've included, people are not an unlimited resource, meaning that if you raise 2,000 men from Vasta Gotlands, then those people get stack wiped off in northern Germany. They ain't coming back. Or rather they are, but it's going to take a while because those pops are going to have to grow again. If a bunch of people die, it will have an extremely, extremely negative impact on your economy. You are going to be wiping out people who were previously producing stuff. And bear in mind, some of those people were previously producing weapons for your army and food for your army. So it's going to mean that you're not just spending, I think, the whole time in endless wars running right on the edge of being out of manpower. Because in EU4, a lot of the time, I find myself, and again, I'm not, the best player in the world, but when I'm doing a world conquest, I find myself basically on the cusp of out of manpower at all times. Because as long as you're not actually out of manpower, there's no strong need to have more manpower. It can deter AI forming coalitions and so on, but there's no strong reason to not have the limiting factor on your expansion be your manpower, because you might as well spend it. Whereas in this case, that's no longer true. Now people dying is really impactful. It's going to have a big drain, which is really cool. Also, raising a levy produces less food and raw minerals, all this kind of thing. So it's important. It's important. There is also an experience system, but we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So mercenaries, we get very little information about in this dev diary. They are recruited from regions of the map. They aren't visible on the map, and they are signed up for a 2-year contract, and you can extend the contract. We'll talk more about mercenaries when we see more about mercenaries. Mercenaries really feel like they are the way to convert money into combat without hurting the rest of your system, basically. So if you can become fantastically wealthy by trade, for example, if you're Venice or Florence or whatever, very, very historically, you might endeavor to offload and outsource the damage that war causes to families to other people's families in exchange for gold, in that wholesome sense. So that seems really fun. Like the idea of getting to a state in the earlier-ish game when you can be rich enough to have your homeland continue prospering because you haven't had to raise levies while using mercenaries for conquest. Really, really cool. Really interesting. And then there are regular regiments. And this is amazing. This is so good. So you have your levies, right? They're the people you just say, hey, come be a soldier. They rock up, they have no experience, they've got no training, whatever. Then there's regular regiments. And this represents a professional army. And the thing about professional armies is that they kick the crap out of non-professional armies. I'm not talking about in EU5, but I'm sure it is the case in EU5. But they are, you've seen the scene probably. Maybe you haven't, so I'll describe it to you in 300, a largely anachronistic film. But anyway, the scene is still cool, where you know, the Spartans show up with their 300 men and the Athenians show up with their whatever. I think historically it was about 5,500 men or something. And they say, you've brought so few soldiers. And he's like, you Athenian, you know, what's your profession? Oh, I'm a leather worker. What's your profession? I am a potter. It's like, okay, Spartans, what is your profession? Warriors. We are soldiers. If you spend your whole life being a regular soldier, you are unbelievably well trained, obviously, relative to the peasant farmer who's just rocked up on his, like, well, I stayed all my whole life in my village making pottery, but then the king says I've got to go and kill people, so here I am. And the idea that there's going to be this transition. Early game, mercenaries and levies, tiny regular regiments, mostly. Late game, huge regular standing trained drilled armies that are a massive drain on the economy but unbelievably effective. That transition is built into the system. In EU4 you have your professionalism slider and it goes slowly up and it gives you some bonuses and it's pretty cool, but that isn't needed. There is no professionalism slider in, I said I was going to talk about this when we go to the relevant talk, but I'm talking about it now because it's exciting. There is no professionalism slider because the move from a non-professional to a professional army is baked in. It costs money and goods and people to maintain regular regiments, and it requires technology to have really good buildings to do it, which means you can't do it in the early game. And not only as technology advances do you become more able to do it, but you have to build a nation capable of sustaining a regular army. And that is brilliant. You're not making a nation capable of doing that by taking the military ideas group, although maybe there are ideas that help it. And you're not doing it by increasing a slider over time just because you happen to have your army drilling. You actually have to build an economy capable of doing it. And that's fantastic because, and this is partly what I mean about, you know, realism isn't a goal in and of itself, but it leads to these fantastic situations where that's a real struggle, a real challenge that nations across the world embarked upon, and those that didn't were conquered by those that did. The move to being able to have an economy which can support a professional army is such a multifaceted challenge. There's so many different things that will feed into that. Oh, as you can tell, I'm quite excited. One of the things which is more abstracted is this. So there are, you know, buildings which do this and give you manpower, which is the thing that you use to build your professional army. Sorry, excuse me. And that is, you know, it's building a tech system which is entirely kind of feels natural is very difficult. But the idea that as ages go by, you get better buildings which allow you to do this more, fair enough. You also have to be able to, you know, give the goods for those buildings, which is much more organic and things like that. So manpower. Manpower is basically the what you can use for regular regiments. And the idea of the manpower is that it's more abstracted, because when you levy 2,000 people from a province, they leave that province, whereas manpower is a little bit more abstracted, but it still has all of the ties back. When men die, they die in the province. You know, they stop existing when they die. The idea of manpower is that this represents the actual trained people. They're not necessarily super trained just because they're in the manpower pool, but they represent, in a very real sense, the ability of these people to you know, pick up arms in a much more competent way. And to do that, you have to have buildings. So, for example, here is a Kurultai, and this gives you 50 monthly manpower. There is a cap on how much manpower you can store. It is 5 years of your manpower gain is what can be stored. And the manpower is somewhat abstracted, but it does remain tied to this province. If this professional army with these manpower die, then people are removed from the the province where the Kurultai is. And that's from attrition as well. So yes, no force limits. This is another thing. Oh yes, this is... the game is going to be, in my opinion, not experience, but my opinion at this stage, this game is going to be much harder to play than EU4 because there are going to be more things which you have to decide. There's no force limit. There's no limit to the number of things you can raise, but regiments, or are they called regiments? Yeah, regiments have manpower upkeep. So there's 100 people in this one, right? Every month it costs 1 manpower to maintain it. Consider that, you know, the attrition which is not caused by unique variables. So it's not attrition because they're sieging, it's just attrition because every group of people, you know, not to be too depressing here, but every group of people you gather has an attrition rate. 1% a month seems quite high, but there you go. You know, people are aging out, people are dying of natural causes. There's upkeep required. And what this means, the combination of the fact that there is ongoing upkeep and there is no force limit, means you can maintain the army that you can maintain. Literally maintain. Not maintain because there's some arbitrary number saying this is how much you can maintain, but actually what you can maintain. And you have to decide what that is, because if you go over the top, you're going to put yourself in an unsustainable position. But even better, maybe it's a good idea to put yourself in an unsustainable position. Maybe temporarily really beefing up and going with this huge army allows you to deliver that alpha strike against your neighbor, and then you scale it back. But that could be the way that you gain your edge. You stockpile stuff, you stockpile manpower, you stockpile goods, you stockpile, you know, stability in your market, you stockpile gold, and then you can go over the top, become unsustainable, force your way in. There's all kinds of things. And the fact that this is dynamic is brilliant. I think it's really good. Units have a lot of attributes. There's discipline, military tactics, army morale, and then power, which sounds like combatability. I'm not going to dive into too much of how this works. It seems pretty similar to EU4. You know, that was good. It was a good system. Seems fine here. We'll talk more about that as it becomes more available. And there is such thing as army tradition, which is gained primarily from the average experience of your armies, increased by drilling them, and as comments reveal, fighting as well, obviously. In fact, the morale and siege ability, while slowly pushing you towards land on the land versus naval societal values, which is very interesting. We'll look more into that as we hear more about it. The other thing about navies, well, no, we'll talk about it as we get to the comments, but so what have we got as the baseline before we dive into some of the comments, which we'll go through relatively quickly because I've already talked about some of the stuff revealed in them. We have levies, which are raised from pops, start with, and I don't think can gain any experience, and damage the economy when you raise them, cost a lot of goods and things to raise, and the places you raise them will then be less productive. You have mercenaries, which is trading money for people willing to die for your cause, which won't damage your economy as much, and you have regulars, which are the beating heart of the transition from levy to professional army, which is going to be so freaking cool. Let's take a look at some of these comments. So there's some various questions around this. You can't levy, or very ineffectually can you levy from non-accepted culture pops. There are privileges and laws that you can do to increase it, which Johan clarifies elsewhere. But this is going to be interesting. As people have pointed out, how does this work for places like Austria, who historically had a lot of cultures which were not accepted, but did contribute a lot to their armies? And that's going to be interesting. You're going to have to do that with specific laws and things like that. It feels like there's a lot more motivation to care about culture. There are historicity concerns here. Not, a wrong use of the term historicity. Historicity is about how you study history, I think, right? Anyway, there's historical concerns here, but I can see how this works really well for driving a game where you are supposed to care about people being in your primary culture, or at least in accepted cultures, and that mattering. And I like that mattering. I think that's worth making some historical sacrifices for. The downside will be, this seems like you would emerge with a meta where kind of integration and getting everybody into your primary culture is going to be something that you just always do, which will be less interesting. So hopefully those laws and privileges are a viable alternative where you can have a more kind of multi-culture nation where you have kind of distinctions between them that are interesting. And okay, I now, let's say, so Austria, I now own Hungary. I have Hungary in a separate trade area with its own language governing that trade area, but I can still get men from them because I have the right laws and privileges, and there are trade-offs. I think that could be really interesting. So just to clarify, yes, the casualties are spread using some clever abstractions that Johan doesn't want to talk too much about, which is fair enough. Which means that basically you do have the ability to have, when those manpower die, it goes back to the places where the manpower was generated, and the same for levies, which is very, very cool. So here's a description of manpower that was a bit more detailed. We're not going with these comments in order. I've moved some of them around so we can stay on topic here. So let's dive into manpower a bit. You have a horse archer regiment, which reduces the pool by 1 manpower per month. As we say, this is just the normal attrition. A Kurultai, if fully supplied, adds 50 each month, allow a pool of 3,000, which is 5 years. He said separately it's 10, but that's what it is in EU4. Can't imagine why he's thinking about EU4 while here talking about EU5, but there you go. So to raise a horse archer regiment of 100 men costs 100 manpower. Nice 1-to-1 conversion in these numbers. So you build a 25 horse archer regiments that costs you 2,500 manpower at a monthly upkeep of 25, which means that your Kurultai is able to support half of that. This Kurultai is using half of its generation just to maintain those 2,500, and that's before any of them die. So if a lot of them die, it will take a lot of time. So this manpower gain will take time to come back from that, which is going to be cool. It's going to be cool. So drilling expects tradition, and tradition is gained on average unit experience, partly based on average unit experience. So having a big army with a professional core, you're not going to get a whole lot of tradition. You need to have a large portion of your army be experienced for it to be really valuable. And yes, mercenaries do affect the population and region they're from, which is interesting. I can't remember if I put the comment immediately after this, but if loads of your pops join a mercenary army and it's hired by your neighbor and they all die, those pops are dead in your region, which would be interesting, because I feel like this opens up avenues of like, okay, well, I'm about to go to war with Germany, but before that I'm going to go to war with France. Let's hire lots of German mercenaries and kill them in the project against France, thereby weakening the German economy and demographics, and meaning that when we go to war with Germany, it will be easier. Ho, ho, ho. I wonder if you can embargo people from using your mercenaries. That seems like it would be important. Or whether you can encourage or discourage mercenary companies rising in your regions. We'll see. Now, this is another element. This is potentially controversial, and I wonder how it's going to go. I'm trying not to make any assumptions. Your regulars need to be in friendly territory to reinforce. And this is later clarified as being in an occupied territory, occupied fort. You can also reinforce, but it's much slower. And this is part of what I mean. This is all feeding into the idea that you're going to have to do kind of quite deliberate campaigns. You're going to have to say, okay, I've got my men. They have a certain amount of food. They have a certain amount of oomph in them. They're going to go on this campaign and then they're going to have to pause. They might have to come back. There's going to be limits in that. You can't just constantly be out there and fighting at war until you either win or lose. There's going to need to be a kind of push and pull to a certain extent. It's going to be really interesting to see how that works out. This requirement to go back to friendly territory to reinforce, are you cycling out people on the front if you have loads of armies? Are you able to maintain a front line with just half your army while the others spend half the time recovering? And I don't know how much of the time they need to spend recovering, but it'll be interesting. And yes, there are naval levies, which, if you're familiar with the history of the time, is entirely accurate. This is before the period, but the burning of Constantinople on the 13th crusade, anyway, whichever it was basically because they wanted to go to the Holy Land. But to do that, they need to get a bunch of boats, unless they want to walk all the way, and who's got time for that? So they go to Venice, and Venice and Genoa were often providing lots of boats for these places, but they don't have, or at least for a lot of the periods, they don't have large standing navies, especially of transport ships and things. So they end up, you have to levy those, and it's going to be really interesting to see how you can generate that. So does that harm your fishing industry? It's gonna be interesting. There's much more nuance in the 12th, 13th, whatever crusade, but it's really interesting. There's going to be the need to the ability to levy transports, which is interesting, because having a kind of huge transport fleet just always kicking around, it always felt a bit weird to me. So the idea that you actually do it as needed, it's very cool. So yes, multiple types of units at once confirmed, and then it looks like the combat itself is going to be very similar. So Johan's saying he likes Excel, an explanation to how does it work. It looks like a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet duking it out, which it's going to stay somewhat like that. Good, to be honest. Like, this is not something that I really don't want them to dive into making the battles more realistic or more controllable mid-battle or things like that, because making that something that's really engaging and interesting to do repeatedly through the campaign is extremely difficult. Levies take time to spawn, and if it's all in one region, it's even slower than local. French army will not reinforce in German lands. So you raise your levies region by region, and I think he clarifies this in some other ones. It's going to be really interesting. So you need to actually levy your troops in regions, consolidate them and march to war. I think that's going to be fun. That's going to be fun. I wonder how automated it will be. Will there be rally points? Can you say like levy in all your regions and then come to the capital? We'll see. We will see. And the current location is where they are at the moment, putting in their requests for. And yeah, this is good. This is a good meme. There's variants of this meme, but it's good stuff. They're going to put in requests to the market saying, "Hey, we need some more, weaponry or something. They need some more food," and they're going to do that in the place where they're warring, which is, that's going to be impactful. That's going to be really interesting how that works. You can mobilize part of a levy, so you can do it per province. You can't, it seems, say, I want half of the levy from London, but you can say, I only want the levy from London, not from Kent. Things like that. Kent is actually larger than a province. Oh, it's per province, not locations. Maybe Kent is a province made of locations. Still not totally sure on exactly what degrees those two go to. So yes, there's no army professionalism. It's too similar to the army tradition unit experience, but it's even better. It's really good that it's missing because it's built in. It's built into the system. When a war is disbanded, yes, they go back to where they came from. Makes total sense. Those that are alive anyway. And levies. So one concern I foresee is you can't raise levies unless you're at war. Should you be able to raise them before the war? They had that before, but it's too easy to exploit the AI, basically. And I buy this. There's going to be difficulties, though. Like, what if I'm in, if I want to raise my levies to exploit the AI, why don't I just declare a nonsense war with somebody, so I'm at war, raise my levies, put them on the border of the person I want to go to war with, then declare the second war? If the AI is exploitable because they can't tell when you're raising your levies and putting them on the border, I'm going to find a way to do that. So, and what about when I have a professional army? So, little concern. We'll see how that plays out. Can your location be depopulated because they all joined the Merry Company and got slaughtered elsewhere? Yes, as we covered, that can happen, which would be interesting. This we have already talked about. Yes, so you can't produce manpower producing buildings where a dominant culture is not accepted. So clarifying, not only can you not really levy many people from non-accepted cultures, you also can't put them in your professional army, which is interesting. It's one of the historical things that this kind of misses, I think, or maybe this would count as accepted, but part of the way the Ottomans integrated people into their culture was specifically by recruiting them as professional soldiers, and janissaries and stuff. And using that as a tool to do it, which is not necessarily modeled, but you can't model everything. Control influences how many levies you get from a province, which makes complete sense. Tracks of what we know about control so far. And this is interesting. Combat should not last months. So they're going to make combat, it seems like, dramatically faster than it has previously been. How they do that, we'll have to see. But as you probably know, in EU4 multiplayer, it becomes farcical. You can have battles that last for almost forever, basically, as more and more people pour more and more soldiers in and staggering them how they go in and things like that. It'll be interesting to see how that works out. And yes, less efficient when reinforcing in a friendly location. And then, yes, confirming that the levies from non-accepted cultures are based on the laws and privileges around it. So there you have it. That is what we know so far about war in EU5. It's going to be hard. There's a lot of things to think about in there. And it's going to come down, I think they sound like really good systems, really interesting systems. It's going to come down to the user experience of playing with them. Like, if I want to tweak all of my armies to have a bit more of this type of regiment, how easily can I do that? Do I have to do that unit by unit? Can I convert one unit to another? Can I say, here's my template, change the template in all my existing armies? It's going to be interesting. It's a challenge that they've set themselves with so many of the systems that we've talked about so far. But I'm hopeful. It seems really good. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to keep making my way through these. I'm probably going to release these at a rate of about 2 a week, just so you know, until I've caught up, and then we'll go back to kind of 1 a week. Some of the videos are going to be multiple Tinto talks all at once. So here, let me give you a spoiler on what's coming up. We've done all the way down to military matters. I'm going to do international organizations and situations at the same time, probably, because those kind of work together quite well. I'm going to do dynasty, cabinet, and laws all at the same time, probably. All the others we will see as they go. There's another thing to talk to you out as I record this in a couple of hours. Looking forward to reading that. I'm looking forward to getting you my views. Thanks for watching. Let me